Hi, all. I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. On the show, I talk to artists, journalists, researchers, other writers, of course, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. This week's guest is Becky Hadeed, a mother to four, curious home cook, lover of extraordinary light, and a host of the Storied Recipe Podcast. Hello, Becky. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to speak with you again.
Yes, because I did feature on Becky's blog, which she will tell us more about now.
Oh, okay. About the storied recipe?
Yes, please.
Yes. So the idea is just that we like to share the stories of people around the world, and there always has to be a starting point for a story. And so for the Storied Recipe Podcast, the starting point is just going to be a recipe from any of my guests. It's a recipe that they cherish. Um, I don't even specify why they have to cherish it. Sometimes for some people, it's because it's significant to their heritage. Sometimes it's pinned to a specific memory. Sometimes it's associated with a person that loved them. And oftentimes it's generally associated with a place, sometimes a place of their birth, sometimes just a place they visited. But always when you start with a recipe that someone cherishes, it is such a natural entry point into deeper conversations of honestly almost any nature. There's almost no topic you don't cover when you start with food, which is amazing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a universal
Mhm.
thing, isn't it? It doesn't matter where you're from, who your
Yep.
family is. Like food is something we all have, quite deep feelings about usually.
Yes,
So
I often say it's primal.
absolutely. So, what was the importance of food to your family growing up?
Yeah, I know. It's funny because truthfully, I just sort of came from like a run of the mill multi-generational American family. Um there's different strands in my family, so some are came to the US later than others, but I didn't really have this strong tie, like food didn't tie me to any sort of like place or heritage or culture that was different to my own, which is not true of most of my guests. Most of my guests are like third culture adults, you would say. So they were sort of maybe raised in one, moved to another, and now are finding their identity as some sort of like amalgamation or yeah, of the two. For me, I didn't, I mean, everybody has identity issues, but when it came to my culture, like I was sort of born again into like a run of the mill American home, grew up in that, you know what I mean? So food didn't have that for me. And in fact, food, none of my grandparents really particularly like to cook. My mom is a great cook, but just again, a very like, meat and potatoes type cook. And so for me, I think it more started with the fact that I like to cook for other people. I love to cook for other people, and that was something that I was born with. I I always wanted to, and when I got older and had a place of my own, it was just something I always liked to do, to have people over, to cook for them, and, to talk to them. So, yeah, I think for me, it didn't come so much from the consuming as the cooking.
I mean, there's something really powerful in giving nourishment to others, and
Yes.
it's something that sometimes is kind of overlooked as just like a thing people have to do, right? But
Right.
it's in many cultures, it's something that that this is how people show love. And
Yes.
it might, in some circumstances, it might be the only way in which you're culturally allowed to show love
Mm,
or and
yes.
affection. And it's
Yes.
something I have seen quite a lot of, and it's it's actually a big part. There's I was reading this book about
Mm.
I don't know if I referenced it in my interview with you earlier, but
Remind me.
about female peasants in
Yes.
in
Yes.
Poland. And the thing that people mention most often about their grandmothers, who
Yes.
lived in that kind of extreme sort of poverty of,
Yes.
World War II, pre-World War II, Polish sort of agricultural areas, is that they were just not taught how to show love and emotions. But of course, they did feel this love and this affection for their children.
Of
They just
course.
did not know, and we're not sort of in a way given permission in their
Yes.
upbringing to show it.
Yes.
And so the only way they could show it was by feeding people.
Yes.
And it's still like a joke I see on social media, people talking about like how like Polish mothers, if they
Yeah.
get like, if they want to apologize, they will never apologize, but they'll like
Yeah.
cut up an apple for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen all the same memes, and what's funny is like, so you'll see it with Polish culture, but there's not a culture that doesn't make that joke. And my older brother laughs about that sometimes. He'll listen to the podcast and he goes, everybody who comes on your podcast is like, the crazy thing about my culture is we show love with food. He's like, all of your guests seem to think it's
Not as
unique to their
crazy, not as
right.
crazy as you think.
Exactly. Yeah. And you remind me of I'm sure I'm guessing you probably follow Olia Hercules. She lives in the UK, but she was Ukrainian. She is Ukrainian. Her brother and father are fighting in the war right now, and she was really sort of she was a pretty well-known cook in the UK, but she was really like propelled to the forefront when the war started. And she says to that exact story, she says that to her, love tastes like apple and onion, because when her mom was making dinner, she would be chopping an onion, and then she would come in and be hungry and say, "Can I have an apple?" And she would cut it on the same
Same
board.
boat. Wow.
And it was like, oh, haven't we all had that experience of the onion tinged apple of just grab it, chop it up, and
Very universal. I mean, it's interesting how like a taste or a smell can
Mm.
trigger a particular memory.
100%.
I mean,
Yes.
do you have like a food like that triggers something for you? Like every time you sort of eat it or smell it, it brings you back.
To to me, it's more of a smell that I've only smelled in one place. I grew up next door to my paternal grandparents, and we were very, very, very close. And they owned this sort of like, I mean, it was definitely more than a cottage, but a very homely little home, like on the bay, on the eastern, in Maryland. We have the Chesapeake Bay, and uh, there was a smell to that house, and I've never smelled it anywhere else. And I can't. It's like I almost like yearned for it because I can't imagine it. You know how you can almost imagine a
Hmm.
taste, or you can close your eyes and see something? Like, I can't close my eyes and smell something, but it's the only place I've ever smelled it, and
But
I
if you
go back.
smelled it, you would sort of be
Oh,
instantly transported,
oh,
isn't it?
yes, yes,
For
yeah.
sure. It's like for me, there's a smell of milk and burning coal, like coal smoke, that always brings me
Really?
back to my winter holidays when I was in Poland, because all the like mountain villages in
Uh-huh.
Poland would
Mm.
use coal burning ovens. I mean, a lot of Poland still does, sadly, but
Wow,
and that smell is just so characteristic, and
interesting. What
that's
is it? Is it like an
and
acrid smell? I don't know that I've ever smelled coal, to be honest.
uh, I mean, I'm sure you would recognize it. It's very
Yeah.
hard to describe because
Mm.
there's something like, for me, it's like very obviously it's like there's a smokiness, but it's very different
Mhm.
to wood
Mm.
burning smell. Like it's almost
Interesting.
like there's a kind of curdling smell in it for me.
Mm.
But people
Okay.
don't experience smells necessarily in the same way, so it's very sometimes very hard to translate.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I think smell is the most elusive
Hmm.
of the senses to pin down. But yeah, like I said, I almost crave the smell because I can't imagine it or revisit it in my mind. I can only experience it when I'm there.
Yes, it's like a continuity link that is just
Yes. Mhm.
really.
Yeah.
I mean, in
Yep.
terms of continuity, I was actually thinking about because of course you're from the US. And
Yes.
to from a European, from an outsider's sort of standpoint,
Hmm.
Americans' concept of cultural and historical belonging, it's just so different to
Yeah.
what people have in the rest of the world.
Mm.
So, like, the mere fact that people very often put their ethnicity or sort of known ancestral origins before American, they sort of hyphenate it, like, Italian American, Irish American,
Right. Yes. Right.
or set it in kind of ethnic terms like Afro American, South Asian
Mm.
American.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
even if it's like, a second, third generation where a lot of the cultural markers are gone, like, the
Right.
knowledge of language or, knowledge of culture, really,
Yes.
food seems to be this one constant, this
That
one.
endures.
Yes, and even if
Mm.
this food is, adjusted,
Hmm.
and very different, like I've seen
Hmm.
a lot of Italians talk
Hmm.
about Italian American food as this just
Hmm.
big entity that like has sometimes very little to do with what they recognize as Italian
Yes.
food.
Yes.
So it's like Italian American food, which is like a whole
Yes.
new thing, isn't it?
Yes.
But people feel so strongly about that, about those
Yeah.
traditions, like, that
Yes.
their food will always look this way.
Mm.
And like in your experience and with the
Mm.
people that have come on your show, like what role does that food play in cementing those community bonds?
Yeah, it's really interesting because so it actually breaks down, actually, not always, but often among ethnicity. And there were, waves of immigrants that came to the United States, and some more recently. So, for instance, if you speak to a Vietnamese American, there's a very good chance that they are, first or at most second or at most third generation. You know what I mean? Whereas if you speak to an Italian American, most likely you're going to go back several generations, and
Mm.
so on and so forth. Like Jewish Americans almost all came at the same time. And so it seems to me, from, this is not a scientific study, but having done 150, 160 interviews at this point, it seems to me that there's almost like a life cycle of the food. And a lot of the people that I speak with, less of a continuity as it is like a reclaiming. And so
Mm.
what happens with so many of my guests, especially if they're maybe like first or second generation, is their parents came either to United States or to the country that they live in now.
Mm.
And their parents had to work so hard to establish a life and a livelihood that they were able to pass very little on to
Mm.
their children. And added to that, the layer of like, oftentimes there's it, it's a conflict. Sometimes there's a wish, sometimes there's a fear that their children will assimilate, right? But there's that like affects the food. So very often the food doesn't necessarily go from the first generation of American to arrive to the second. But then what happens is that second starts at some point in their life to feel, I want to say, almost panicky, of like, I don't I don't know. I know that I am connected to this culture, but that I don't know what that means for me. And it's almost like, I mean, so many of my guests have expressed almost like they feel like maybe the floor falls out from under them. And they just say, I
Mm.
don't know what that means for me. And one of the first places they go back to is the food. But often, sometimes they go back to that parent, that is like their first link to their place of origin or their homeland. But a lot of times I've found what they do is they have to go back 2 generations, because that generation that came to the US, or wherever they're living, again, it was almost like a survival mode, if that makes
Mm.
sense. And so a lot of times I talk to people who their memories are more rooted with their grandparents. Their memories of food are more rooted with their grandparents than their parents.
Mm.
Or they just started to discover, they started to find, heritage cookbooks or something like that. So yeah, what I often find is that they are missing that sense of continuity, and they're reclaiming something that they've lost.
I mean, I find the idea of identity as a form of
Mm,
storytelling very interesting.
mm,
And I'm sure that there's like loads of studies could be written on that subject from a sort of psychologist sort of point of
mm.
view, anthropological, and it's when it comes to like all countries are made up, right? In in the end, like when you're talking
Correct.
to
Right.
Italians,
Right.
Italians from Italy, um, they will speak different languages, like
Right.
they're different dialects, but
Yes.
a person who exclusively speaks in dialect from like Milan might not
Yeah.
necessarily
Right.
might have trouble communicating with someone who would exclusively speak
Right.
like a dialect,
Right. Right.
from Sicily or something.
Mm.
So it's I mean, they wouldn't exclusively speak it, but you see what I mean. So it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and there's a lot of for political reasons or so most I think mostly political socially reasons, people try to sometimes recreate that sense of identity using different markers. So my parents' generation in Poland seems to have lost a lot of that kind of old skills, if you see what I mean, when it comes
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
sort of herbal medicine, for example, or some kind of more obscure traditions when it comes to
Mm.
cooking and
Woodworking,
food.
agriculture. Yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
so
specifically. Mm.
so uh, in my generation, I see there is this kind of Slavic renewal, as in like people are trying to reclaim the sort of
Yeah. Yeah. You
Slavic way
started
of
to
doing,
mention
which
this in our interview. Yeah.
yeah, but that is not obviously going to, when we're talking about authenticity, because people are very concerned with authenticity, and I think we need
Yes.
to kind of sometimes let go of that. If you
Yes.
see what I mean, like
Mm.
because you're never going to recreate something in a way that's truly authentic, and you will have no way to verify whether it's authentic. When someone is trying to cook in a way that they think ancient Slavs cooked, and just it's very difficult. Also, like when you go across like national borders, Poland in the 16th century was very much to the east. It was very different to how it looks now. So
Right.
you're not going to have the same products, the same traditions.
Right.
I remember I read this article once about traditional Polish food from the 16th century.
Mm.
And it was closer, the author of the article claims, that to what Indian food is now
Mm.
than what Polish food is now,
Mm.
because Poland had access to all those spices. So,
Right.
so
Yeah.
when, so,
There's a, go ahead.
sorry. No, I mean, I was just going to ask you then, like,
Mm.
do you see a lot of kind of introspection on that concept of authenticity and what a national food means to your guests?
Yes. Yes. For sure. And a lot of it, again, goes back to this idea of reclaiming and trying to. I was thinking when you were speaking about the Polish food, there's a. Are you familiar with Zuza Zak? She's
Oh
a.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So she came on the podcast twice actually. And I remember reading one of her cookbooks and her being like, I I just couldn't quite compute when I read about, yeah, the impact of the Silk Road, spices on Polish cuisine. I just couldn't put it together, at all. And so, again, for someone like her, it's this idea of reclaiming, I think sometimes, and going back to things that have been lost. Um, in terms of questions of authenticity, it's a tricky subject. Again, I'm not gonna say uniquely to Americans, but I think especially to Americans, there's a lot of, um, differing opinions here in the United States about when when you cross from complementing a culture by making their food and trying to make it in a traditional and authentic way, and when you appropriate their culture. And I think there's different sensitivities in the United States to like when that happens. And so for me personally, that's actually something that I have to like sort of navigate a little bit. There's a particular dish that's really um, uh, it's more than beloved. It's sort of like it's like the calling card, as one of my guests said, of a lot of African nations, jollof rice.
Hmm.
And sometimes when I make, I've had 3 different guests give me jollof rice recipes, all 3
Hmm.
different. And sometimes I feel like I'm wading into an area where I could actually be like attacked when I
I
make a
mean,
jollof rice.
to be
That
honest,
is mm,
anybody who would attack you for
mm,
cooking food, lovingly preparing food from another
mm.
culture, is not a serious person and should not. Not
Well,
yeah,
there's
I
and
mean,
in my case, I'm pretty well covered by the fact that someone has like given this to me, so they've given their implicit
yeah.
permission. But there's I interviewed someone. Her name was Shema Sadat, and she had presented at some like Oxford symposium, and she, had strong feelings that certain people should not be making certain dishes and serving them in their restaurant because they just essentially didn't have the right to do that. And
Hmm.
there's the question when it comes, for instance, to Southern cooking. You have Southern cooking and soul cooking, and traditional Southern cooking was influenced by the many Black cooks that were in the kitchen as slaves. And so there's a sensitivity towards like these
Hmm.
Paula Deen making these Southern dishes. Has she in some way stolen something that was never like the Southern to, I mean, these are questions that we've discussed some on the podcast, and it's not so much for me to
I understand
it
it's
doesn't
it's a
matter in a way.
very it's a
Yeah.
scary thing to
Yes.
be discussing for people in America,
Mm,
and it's a very, but I can tell you, like, this is such a,
mm,
for from European perspective, this feels
mm,
like such an American thing to be
mm,
discussing. And sometimes it kind of crosses
mm,
over where people don't understand certain concepts, and
mm.
they try to kind of bring that different sensitivity here. Because I mean,
Which is
I'm
interesting.
friends with people from so many cultures, and
Yeah.
not one of those people would object to someone making food from a culture.
They
I
would
had
find it a compliment, right?
I mean, absolutely. Of
Right.
course, if they, I had this conversation with uh, this guy, Ifta, who is a guide in Kolkata, and his
Mm,
whole thing, he's just so
mhm,
knowledgeable about Kolkata, and we're like, he was saying he found it very fun. Like, he has no problem people from other cultures claiming Indian heritage, as in, like, this is also mine,
mm,
as in, because I am part Indian. This is mine, even
mm.
though their primary culture might be sort of British or American. But he
Interesting.
really takes issue with people
Mhm.
who will then claim that someone else can't is not allowed to access that culture. And
Interesting.
because my so
He's like,
my
"Don't gatekeep my culture for me," is what he's
absolutely,
saying.
that is very,
Interesting.
and that is something that I've
Yeah.
seen happen quite a lot of social media, where people take
Oh, yes.
someone else's story, because for um when you're something American, like,
Yeah.
this from, so for example, if you say you're Polish American, from my perspective as a Pole, I'm like, I welcome you, and
Mm.
you're welcome
Mm.
to everything that's Polish, and I'm very excited that you want to
Mm.
claim some of that back, and I think it's such
Mm.
a positive experience. But
Mm.
if you then went and told someone else you can't be making pierogi
Mm.
because that doesn't belong to you, I would I would stand up and saying, like, everybody's welcome. Do not
Right.
gatekeep.
Right.
but this is, and of course people might have different perspectives because you
Mm,
can't sort of speak universally for any one
mm,
nation or any one ethnicity. But I
right.
find it very interesting that people would gatekeep food because the food is a universal thing for people to bond over. So
Yes, yes, yes. There is I mean, I would say the distinction there, and I'm not necessarily arguing that I agree with this point of view, but I can understand the
yeah.
perspective.
And for
I
you
think
as a white American, it's
correct.
a very easy thing for someone to try and discredit you on. And I
Yes.
understand that. Like this is,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah, and there wasn't I mean, there really wasn't I mean, you may feel differently. I don't know. I might be ignorant, but there really wasn't any sort of like hierarchical relationship between I mean, American and Polish culture. And so if there was like and you know what I'm saying? And so if there was like again, it's the idea of like have you taken something from my culture via colonization,
yeah,
right? Or slavery that you never had the right to take. Now, there's a lot of
yeah,
questions over like me personally,
yes.
really? But that's a whole thing in the US right now anyways is what is one person responsible for when it comes to what happened culture
Mm.
there's so much there
I
there's
think
so
I
much
think
there
there are concepts of basically someone profiting, the issues about profiting from
profit is the
something, but
question.
that the person
Mm,
who is originally of that
mm,
culture cannot profit from or is
profit
being
is
penalized from.
yes. Yes, and even the
So
interview that I brought up earlier, I think she would again sort of give me a pass because people are willingly sharing these recipes with me and I'm as respectfully as I possibly can,
mm,
sourcing ingredients, trying new techniques, all of that. And I'm not ultimately, well, I guess I am profiting from it now through my blog, but you know what I mean? I'm not
yeah,
profiting from it like I'm selling it as my own creation.
no, of course. I
Mm.
mean, I think it boils down to respect as well. And
Agreed.
like, food has a very humanizing effect as well. So
Mm. Hmm.
like, I strongly feel that like trying to gatekeep food from people
Mm.
is a really dehumanizing thing to do.
Mm.
And the thing about sharing food and food
Hmm.
stories, like,
Mm.
like what you do, it encourages people to share in the element of their culture and
Hmm.
traditions that has the power to create dialogue because it's
Oh, exactly.
accessible, because everybody can
Exactly.
taste it.
That's right.
Yeah. So
That's right. That's right. You've completely hit the nail on the head. Agreed. Agreed completely. It's like a starting point for dialogue.
and I think sometimes when we're sharing elements of our culture that don't translate as well, like
Mm.
humor doesn't translate across cultures very well, for
No,
example.
and language actually divides us. I mean, just quite naturally, in the
Hmm.
sense that, like, I don't understand what you're saying unless I put
Yes.
forth years
Yeah,
and years and years of concerted effort. Um,
absolutely. And the language and like linguistics itself also
mm,
dictates how people think. Like there are
mhm.
words that like in different languages that don't have direct
Yes.
equivalent in in
Mm,
another languages, and that
mm,
dictates how we communicate.
mhm,
And when we're talking about smell bringing
mm,
memory, so I was talking to
mhm,
my Anglo-Egyptian friend recently, and
mm.
we were comparing the words that don't have equivalent in English, and she was saying that in Egyptian there's a word which I will not repeat now because I don't remember.
I understand.
But she said that there's a word that describes the smell of something that is like oily in a pan, like from
Mm,
frying salmon, for example, or frying eggs.
mm.
If you pour hot water over it, if you wash it with hot water, and that is like apparently an incredibly repulsive smell to her,
Mhm.
and that is not something I had ever identified.
That's
And
fascinating.
I was actively thinking about it when I
Mm.
was, cleaning my pans,
Yeah.
because I was given a word or a
Mhm.
concept of a word that describes the smell. And I have never
Mm.
found it offensive. But then I thought,
Mm.
okay, yeah, it's not a very pleasant smell.
Mm. That
And
is so interesting.
so, like there's people who have a gene where they don't, when they find like cilantro in America, like the
Yes, they think it
coriander,
tastes
very
like stink
offensive.
bugs. Yes.
Yes. And there's people who can't smell stink bugs at all.
I would wish that upon myself.
Yes, exactly. There's people who can smell ants, and apparently they smell very offensive.
Really?
Yeah, so if they have the gene for smelling ants specifically.
Wow. You have
So
to wonder why that developed or was given to certain people. That's
and
incredible.
and you have to think about it like,
What was the
so
point?
when it comes to food as well, like it's
Mm.
interesting whether like what I taste, whether it is what you taste, isn't it?
Yes, and colors.
But it's something that then we can actually start a dialogue and conversation over.
Yes, it is, and it's also a way of, when you will try a new flavor or a new ingredient or a new technique, it's a way of, like, positioning yourself as a learner. You know what I mean? It's a
Hmm.
way of positioning yourself that way, which really opens someone to share their story, and their life with you because they know that you're coming to them in a position of, with some humility, with some humbleness, and a willingness to learn, a willingness to look at things differently because our palates are really very different. And people often make assumptions about my American palate. I was just speaking with a friend about this yesterday, an Icelandic friend, and they just, uh, yeah. And so, yeah, I think that when I'm willing to try something and
Mm.
learn, it makes them feel much more free to share their story with me. And the same if you have someone to your home and I feel so strongly. You're probably going to be like, why is this even a debate? But I feel so strongly about cooking to someone's allergies and sensitivities and
Of
everything like
course.
that because it's a way of saying like you are the one who matters here, your needs matter here. And so I think that's another
Well, of
reason like
course. I mean, I don't know. Why would I have strong
I
feelings
know, I
about
know
it?
you were gonna say no, I was saying you would say, well, of course, but not everybody actually feels that way. There's kind of like sometimes a feeling of
There's people who are happy to poison their guests, then.
right, right, right. Oh, you're reminding me, yeah, of the mushroom conversation we had. Yeah, there's sometimes a feeling of like you're being a burden to me. You know what I mean? And so again, when you're willing to cook someone's food and to learn from their food, it automatically opens dialogue because you are putting yourself in the position of a learner, of a vulnerable person, who's willing to say, like, your needs and your comfort matter to me. Possibly even above my own, because I don't really think this tastes that good, but I'm going to try it. Or I'm afraid of this
Mm,
flavor, but I'm going to try it. I think that's another reason why it really does foster dialogue and storytelling.
absolutely. I think it's yeah, I mean, I think it's really like a beautiful way to create
Mm,
community as well, because it's the sort of the ultimate icebreaker, isn't it? The food. And I think people who don't like sharing food, like
mm,
I
yeah.
find it I find it very hard. I know most people are out there. I find it very hard to relate to them because, like I think I actually wrote it into my novel, but I can't trust people who don't like food because that means they don't
There's
like
a
life. It means they've given up
yeah,
on life. And it's like, where
there's
can you start
someone
with them?
yeah, it's like maybe it's Julia Child. There's some quote about that for sure. Yes, I was gonna say something else about the oh, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, there's it might be I think it's Julia Child. There's some famous quote about like I don't want to be around people who don't like food. I don't like people who don't like food.
Yes, it's just it's like the concept of breaking bread,
Mm,
right? It's
yes.
such a, and like I grew up with it. It's like this is a very intrinsic part of Polish culture, right? So
Mm,
it's like that is ancient, that is pre-Christian, ancient Slavic sort
yes,
of
right.
tradition that has endured. when
Yeah.
you greet someone with bread and salt, like that
Mm,
creates a sense of bond and responsibility from the host to your guests.
the
And that is
responsibility.
like,
That's so interesting.
I mean, we have legends about people who broke the hospitality rule, and like there was of a king Popiel who basically poisoned his guests with his wife, and they were eaten by mice. Like he and his children, his wife were
Wow.
eaten by mice, because it's just, this is the kind of, like, if you break the hospitality rule, you offer someone bread in your home, you break bread, and then you betray
That
them, that is like the whole earth will turn against you.
So this is so actually I want to ask you a question about this because I have like kind of always a strong response in the back of my head to this. But before I say that, I want to mention also in terms of like using food as the beginning of storytelling and as a way to connect. What is interesting is how many dishes you think are from one place, but there's such a similar dish in another culture so far
Absolutely.
away. And that is something in terms of fostering community that is like one of my favorite things to do is I'll send out my newsletter and say, oh, you know, Gabriela gave me this pasztet dish from Poland. And then I'll hear, now maybe it didn't happen in this particular circumstance, like, oh, we have something just like that
Yeah.
in here or there. And sometimes the number one example was there's a bread. It was given to me from yes, a woman who grew up in Singapore. It's called roti canai. There's different, or roti paratha, and it's basically this bread
Mm.
that you make with
Yeah.
ghee. And I kid you not, every continent except for Antarctica, I had hundreds of people write and say, we have a bread just like that,
I mean,
and
it's
then
just
share the
flour and
name
water. It's just
and a
flour
lot
and
of
water,
ghee,
isn't it?
a lot of
Ghee.
ghee, yeah, a lot of ghee. So, which is the
The
magic,
ghee is
you know. But
negotiable.
yeah, and you wind it, and it's fun to eat, and it was just really cool. Again, so as a unifier, you start to see what we have in common when you have
Absolutely. I
food.
mean, there's only so many ways to fold a dumpling, right? And
It, right. Exactly. There are infinite things to put in the middle, but so many
so,
ways to fold it.
that is also,
Mm,
when sometimes people who have maybe not had access to many cultures
mm,
outside of their own
mm,
try to gatekeep other people's cultures,
mm.
and then they find out that this is not like exclusively, like, the one
Exactly.
constant in human history was migration.
100%. And intermarrying and having children.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
so you
Yes.
will have very, like, there's
Yes.
Chinese dim sum, there's a Cantonese dim sum that look very similar to what my grandma makes,
Yep. Absolutely.
and it's
Absolutely.
and it
I
might
agree
be
entirely.
served with different condiments,
Yes.
but it's the
Yes.
same thing. And it's but that's beautiful. Like, to
It
me it's
is.
beautiful.
Yes, to find those commonalities and say, well, if we have this in common, what else
Mm,
might we have in common, you know? But I did want to ask you a question because I always the reaction, the story about the king and queen who poisoned their guests and then the mice
mm.
ate them, and they sort of broke these cardinal rules of hospitality. To me, that's always things like that bring up the same discomfort I have with the way that we do, just because it's so recent, like gift exchanges in
Mhm.
America. And sometimes in some cultures, and this is not an American thing, like there's many people in the United States who are happy to say, I don't like to cook, I don't like to host, it's just not my thing. And that there's no shame in that
Mm.
in the United States. I mean, I don't know because I do like to cook, so I've never maybe somebody feels like there is shame in that, but there's really not. But I always find it interesting, these rules. And my husband's culture is like that, where hospitality is such a cardinal rule. And I often think, again, similar to the gift exchanges, but when it becomes an obligation, is it still hospitality?
I think it's more about, um like, kind of, it's a social contract thing. So it's
Mm,
not so much about making your guests sort of stay pleasant, which
mm,
of course is like, you would,
a
but
goal. Mm,
but it's about guaranteeing safety. And so when people traveled across great distance, that was part of the culture. Like you needed to feel safe with your hosts. And it's interesting, like that is a feature in many cultures, but I understand this is not a feature in all cultures by any means. And like, when you look at like kind of Norse mythology of like ancient Norse countries, that is, they did not have necessarily the same guarantee of safety for the guests. When you look at the way their gods behaved, the way their heroes behaved, that was not you could be having meals with someone and then whack them on the head. So
right.
with no punishment for coming at all. So and it's interesting is there's been quite a lot on. So I mean, I have never been to Sweden, so I am I can't speak to its authenticity, but I've seen a lot of people say they're Swedish on social media say that they don't feed their guests.
So yes, interestingly, so my oldest son lives in Germany right now. He's attending university there, and he hasn't necessarily experienced this, but we heard from other people that German culture is similar, that they would maybe, if you're German and you disagree with this, please forgive me, but we were reading about this and several German people speaking out about it. I think it was in response to like actually a comedy routine. Someone, Laura Ramoso, I think, and her mother is German, and I think it was like in response to her, that they would think nothing, for instance, of like if a child had a friend over, sort of saying like, okay, well, we're going to eat now, so you just.
So I've seen that. So I've seen that on Sweden. I haven't heard of that in Germany.
I mean, I don't know. My son certainly hasn't experienced it.
But I mean, the Germans I have come across would never.
Would definitely.
Would feed you. But I have seen that it's definitely a standard in some sort of Scandinavian countries to not just not feed. Oh, like what you say, like a child comes into your house and you just don't offer them dinner and you eat in front, like that is that. I could never, like my Polish heart breaks. Like, it's just like, how could I eat in front of someone else?
Right.
And not offer them a portion of my food. That is like,
you used a word earlier when you first brought this up and we're sharing about the bread and salt. And it, to be honest, the word shocked me. And it's what led me down this line of thinking, but you used the word responsibility. And I think in our I can definitely speak to American culture. I don't actually think we feel like the responsibility to feed guests. To be honest, people I often meet people who seem surprised that I say like, oh, do you want to come over for dinner? And so maybe that is like a breakdown. And to be honest, it may have to do with the fact that we are at this point in time a fairly wealthy nation, and we're sort of assuming people have their next meal, whether it's at our house or not. Whereas, like you said, this idea of like a guest arriving from a long and difficult and perhaps dangerous journey, you have a responsibility to feed them. I don't think that's how we think about food. I've never heard the term responsibility used in conjunction with food. And that's fascinating to me because I would say it is a responsibility to feed the hungry.
It's really interesting because obviously it's not feeding the hungry in a sense that like someone I don't know, but like which is obviously the general moral responsibility to make sure people don't go hungry. But like but I think it's like a bond creation. So if I like the idea that like the food is so universal that if you come into my home, which is my intimate space, then we're bonding over food. And this is how I show you that you're a kind of, a person who is close to me. Like I can't imagine not offering my guests anything. That would be like to me shameful. And I don't necessarily
I feel that way personally, but I don't think that's a part of my culture.
Expect that necessarily. I mean On some level I do, because all of the
Mhm,
people I know feel like similarly. Like I don't
mhm,
have any friends who would
mm.
like at least the symbolic cup of tea, right?
Right, there's there's always a hot
Like
beverage.
that is symbolic. That is like a
Yes.
kind of like a
Mm.
marker for like I have offered you nourishment, you know?
Mhm, mhm, mhm. I've offered you a moment for us to be together
Yes.
in yeah, I
And to
yeah,
converse over this
yes,
beverage. Yes.
yes, yes.
And it's
Mhm,
like the thing is, it's like food, it's always a conversation starter. And
mhm,
when we're and it's funny because like people have such, when you were talking about like jollof rice, and
mhm,
it's so funny because again, like a lot of countries sort of make jollof rice,
mhm.
and then like when you talk about like when I have some Nigerian friends and I have some like Ghanaian friends, and
Right,
then
right, 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 right. Yes,
they each feel so strongly,
yes,
and they will talk
yes,
about like their jollof being best. And I mean,
yes.
how dare you even suggest that there's competition in place?
Right,
But there's clearly
right.
and the fact that I have heard it from multiple sources just shows that
Mhm.
there are strong feelings on the matter.
Right, 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 exactly. Yeah,
So
and then I
yeah,
just had a woman from Cameroon give me a jollof rice with coconut milk and shrimp in it, and that's the one I was putting up, and I was like, "Oh, some Nigerian's gonna be angry with me." But she had a Nigerian mother, this guest from Cameroon, which was interesting.
so
So,
like you basically
anyhow,
have to
yeah.
say like Cameroon jollof.
Y
you know,
yes,
it's a
yes,
very, very specific, like that this is not the universal Jollof experience that you're providing here.
exactly, yes.
I mean, so we were talking about like the gnarly topics of kind of
Mm,
cross-cultural sort of food
mm,
appreciation, but when it
mm,
comes to cross-generational food
mm,
appreciation, like food is a bonding thing, food is like a continuity of tradition. So when we talk about like you talk about being a mother, and you're passing on your food
mm,
traditions, and you kind of give your children a sense of belonging with every meal you put on a table. So
mm.
how does that concept fit into your family life? How do you pass that
Mm,
on?
yeah, this is so I just released an episode actually interviewing each of my four sons.
Oh
And
wow.
yeah, yeah, it was really fun. And what I always find amazing is again, what having a conversation with each of them solely on the topics of food and cooking, their personalities shone forth so uniquely and so distinctly, just in that conversation in terms of their approach to food. So for me, it really is a matter of supporting. I have 2 kids who are just love to cook. Different ways, very, very, very different ways. But I support them as much as I can. I always loved to have my kids, in the kitchen, and with those 2, I support them as much as possible. My 17-year-old, and this is what we talked about in the interview, doesn't love to cook. Food's kind of not that big of a thing to him. It's like he's hungry, he eats. It's just all of these things that we talked about, he doesn't feel that. And I
With
feel
a
like
mom
as
like you, it could be a temporary element of rebellion, I would say. It's like, what can I rebel against? Food.
you know, he just isn't. He's always been sort of like he never has overindulged. As a child, it was like when he was done. And some people, it's just not as important to them. And so for me, I just want to support that as well and not make him feel a burden. Again, to me, it's important to me that you share your gifts with the world. You share, and
Hmm.
if that's not his gift, like that's okay.
I mean,
You
beyond being able to like just take care of himself, isn't
take care of himself.
it?
Exactly, exactly. Yes.
I
But
had to put it in there.
we were even saying, with whoever, he spends more time cleaning up in the kitchen. And like, there's going to be a trade-off whoever he lives with, wherever he lives. If he understands
Hmm.
that the trade-off is like you might have to clean the bathroom while somebody else cooks, you know what? If that's not your thing, okay.
If it's
And
not,
so
yeah.
but yeah, I agree. You have to he's
I feel
tasked with
very strongly that all adults should be like, it's just a basic adult skill. Like you need to be able to feed yourself. It doesn't have to be that tasty. It doesn't have to be good food. You need to be able to feed yourself and like whoever you take care of.
I agree, and be able to identify what's nutritious for you, you know? So yeah, for me, it
that's
really is
ideal.
yeah, which, you know, my oldest has, he lives on his own, you know, in Germany, and at 18 is completely shopping and feeding for himself, and has um completely extinguished his migraine disorder in Germany by eating nothing. He eats literally nothing processed there, which is amazing to me. That's a whole different conversation, European versus American food.
Oh yes. I mean, I
uh,
have watched many show
it's
comparing contents in American food versus the same brand, same product. Like, you know, even
yeah.
there was the most famous one I think was the instant oats. They're like, I might have
Mm,
them somewhere in a cupboard. In the UK, like it has like two ingredients. Like it has
mm,
oats in it, and it
hmm.
has like the strawberry powder that you have. Like
Yeah,
because I bought the strawberry one, right? Like
interesting.
freeze
Yeah.
dried strawberries.
Mm,
Um, and the American same product is
mm.
just a list of ingredients a mile long, and there is no chance in hell this is good for you.
No, he suspects the biggest difference is the bread. Um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
he thinks that's the biggest difference. But again, yeah, he's had a migraine disorder since he was 7 years old,
Oh
and
gosh.
he's experienced zero in Germany, zero,
Yeah,
with the
there
stress
there
of
might
going
be a
and living on your own at
particular.
18. Yeah, he's experienced
There are
zero.
some very common ingredients in
Mhm,
American process, sort of American foods, that are not particularly good for you, but the attitude in the European Union to food safety versus FDA
mm,
is the legal approach is basically in according to the FDA, you basically have to prove that a foodstuff is dangerous
mm,
for it to not be allowed into foodstuffs.
mm,
Whereas in the European Union, you have to prove that a foodstuff is safe for you to be able
mm.
to sell it as food.
So wildly different burden.
It
Mhm.
is, yes. So it sounds similar, but it's very, very, very different, isn't it? It's not.
Very different. Mm.
So, and also with the FDA, like you don't have any legal obligation to accurately represent the percentage of what's in your food.
Mm. Yeah,
At
yeah,
least
even
that was,
calories.
at least that was the case like a few
Mm.
years ago.
Yeah, even calories. I was listening to someone the other day, and you're allowed to a margin of error of 20%, which is significant.
Yeah. That is
Significant. And it's not, I mean, it's yeah.
20%. Oh
Anyhow.
my God.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
Anyhow.
I have
Yeah.
like one last question for
Go
you
for it.
because so aside from being an incredible cook, and I am so impressed with how you're able
Oh.
to take someone's stories and someone's recipes for
Aw.
things you might have never tasted before and then
Mm.
recreate it. That
Well,
is.
for yours, I watched quite a few YouTube videos of Polish cooks.
But you haven't tasted it before, and you know what?
No.
Like the taste test and the kind of
Mm.
the tactile element of it,
Mhm.
you know, that
Mm.
is really, really hard to recreate if you have never tasted something before.
Mm.
And but you're also like an extraordinarily talented photographer. And
Mm.
so how do you like what's your approach tying in the stories and the images to create a narrative?
Oh, yes. Which is just one of my favorite things. I really, I mean, honestly, everything just comes down to listening to people. It really does. And so I try to listen to people, and I have, you know, as you know, um, a survey that I send out in advance and just ask even what visual elements they associate with the recipe. And I just try to incorporate those and the colors. And, you know, in your case, there was like a look to even the cover of your book, you
Mm.
know, that I just wanted to, you know, incorporate. And so to me, it really just all comes down to listening to someone and trying to translate as that as best I can,
I love that. I mean,
visually.
your images of a pasta which is which is because it's like it doesn't necessarily it's not the
Mm,
most attractive looking food stuff
right.
if you see me
Hmm.
because it is essentially a type of a meatloaf,
Yes.
um
Hmm.
like some people doing pate and meatloaf, right?
Mm,
So it's not visually, immediately visually appealing. And yet
Mm.
you have made it look so beautiful. And
Thank you.
it just really made me think of like all the pastas I had in Poland.
Wow.
And it
That's
was, and that is the kind of cultural exchange that I think is really beautiful. And this is
oh, thank
something
you.
that I think you should continue with no fear in your heart, because that is
Thank you.
because it
Thank
is
you.
so beautiful to, like,
Mm.
to spread the love of food,
Mm.
you know.
Yes. I feel like it's my offering. It's my way of honoring and respecting someone's story and their tradition. I always say, like, we look at our food through the glasses of love. And I want to, I guess I want to be that pair of glasses. Like, I want to change the food into something beautiful for those of us who don't see it with the memories. And it's, it's, it's it's a joy, like, it's a challenge, and I love that. I love that challenge. It's a joy.
And I mean, you do you do it so wonderfully. It's like, it's really, I feel
Oh,
like your
that's so
blog
kind
is
of
such
you.
a beautiful bridge. Like, that's how I
Oh,
think about it. And it's
oh,
um yeah.
that
And
means
I
so much to me. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for
uh
the encouragement not to fear.
no, I mean, you know what, like, you can, of course, there, like, there's an American context where people
Mm,
feel strongly because of ongoing kind of, you
mm,
know, tensions
mm,
that have nothing to do with food itself, and that
mm,
have nothing to do with other cultures as well. Like, it's
mm.
so in terms of the kind of, I can't speak for like how Americans might feel, but I can definitely say that people like me, from different cultures outside, just look at it and see the love.
Mm. Thank you. That really means it means so much to me. Thank you so much.
All right. So on that note, thank you so
Mm,
much for coming. And this is Becky Hadeed, everyone. And I will put a link for the Storied Recipe Podcast in
mm.
the description below. Thank you for watching the video. Every week there's something different. So click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.